visit, and I will come again. That's a threat. That is. Now, I'm going to talk today about things that are related to. And I'd like to thank in particular Ivane for organising all of this, and everything else.
Thanks to Eka, in fact, it was Eka's idea, and we are very grateful to Eka for arranging this meeting today. Thank you.
This is the best way to do this. This is the best way to do this. Okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about research that I've been engaged in over the last few years, and I picked a particular example from this research, and this is an example that is actually related to Georgia. That's obviously why I picked it. I have never been to Georgia before, and I do not speak Georgian, so what I'm doing is quite risky. But it is based on archival research that I've done mainly in Ukraine, but also to a certain extent in Moscow and in Russia. It fits into my overall research project at the moment, which has to do with the ways in which market exchange worked in the 17th to 19th centuries in the region between empires. In other words, in the regions in particular between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. As we know, this includes Georgia. If I had the necessary languages, I would extend this to Persia, but unfortunately I do not know Persian, at least yet. And I'm going to give you two case studies today. The first I'm going to do very briefly, but I'm going to do it by way of comparison. Because it kind of balances what I'm going to talk about with Georgia. So the first one is actually more to do with Ukraine, and the second one is more to do with Georgia and someone moving through Georgia. It's a comparison, if you like, of two life stories. And they both relate to the last years of the 17th century and the very early years, the first decade of the 18th century. Now, I'm building this on a lot of research into trade and trade relations in this period and the way traders operate. And some of the names that I use, and there are others you can see there, quite a few have to do actually with Armenian trading communities, because this was the most established and sort of trading network connecting Eurasia together in the period between the 16th and the early 19th century. So we learn a lot from the Armenian experience, but also looking at Ukrainian and Russian lands. There's some very important work by Isaievich and the Ukrainian scholar, and then Kozlova, who's a Russian scholar, and basically these people talk about the way there's a massive increase in institutions and institutional frameworks that take place in these lands during the course of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and then going on through the 18th century, whose purpose were these formal institutions, whose purpose was to organize difference, to resolve disputes, to regulate trade. These institutions fostered and went hand in hand with an increase in commerce, of market exchange. Now, the focus of a large part of my research was actually being a particular town in Ukraine. It's called Nizhin, or Nizhny in Greek, or Nizhin in Russian. So this is actually going to be one of the towns that you will hear mentioned quite often in this talk, in both the case studies that we're talking about. But my argument here is actually going to draw on a classical scholar who talks about trade in the ancient world, and this is C.R. Whitaker, and he's written a large number of books actually on late Roman trade, including his Late Roman Trade and Traders, which is a work in 1983, but there are many others. And he develops a concept of trade which is called tide trade. That is a form of exchange that is controlled by only a small number of different centers of authority, and hence also economic power. So Whitaker, in his discussion, signals out the Roman Emperor at his court, which controlled the manufacture of certain commodities and granted tax exemptions and other privileges. And he also singles out the church, which in Whitaker's analysis was involved in the commercialization of late Roman production. And in his view, such operations were carried out not by free enterprise entrepreneurs, but by agents who received tax exemptions. Similar analysis offered in Whitaker for certain of the large landowners of the time and the production of their estates. Now, this is the direction that actually some scholars of particularly the Russian borderlands have followed for the 17th and 18th century and for trading productions there. And I'll single out one in particular. There's someone called John Ledun, who's an American scholar, and he has written a very important article called Geopolitics, Logistics and Grain, Russia's Ambitions in the Black Sea Basin, 1737 to 1834. And what he argues is there are basically no cities in this region at this time. So in the absence of major urban centres, of major cities, in the pre-19th century period, it's actually the militaries that are generating the demand for products, and in particular for things like grain, and providing a stimulus for the commercialization of grain production. And this actually connects the whole of the northern part of the Black Sea littoral with particularly Poland and Polish territories inland, which are the main sources for production of the grain that is then feeding either the Russian militaries in the north, or then you can imagine something similar happening with the Ottoman militaries on the other side, slightly further south. It's not just grain, of course. There are a whole range of other products that are needed to run a military, not only the weapons, but also the clothes, the leather, the boots, what have you. And all of this creates a certain type of economy which is focused on the needs of, in this case, the military, though one can extend this and then sort of include monasteries and church and things like that to make the picture a little bit more complicated. And in my work on looking at Ukraine, and particularly the court of the hetman Mazepa, I've seen that this is exactly one of the things that merchants called Greeks in the region are doing. They're supplying Mazepa with all the goods that's necessary to run his court and to run his military. Things like horses, to give a good example, which were supplied in large numbers to him by Ottoman Orthodox merchants in 1707. So this idea of tied trade, of trade that is linked to certain needs of state, church, certain major landowners, actually goes against the thrust of most of the scholarship of the last 2 decades, which has tended to play up the autonomy of trade and traders in the 17th and 18th century. So a good example of this is a very, very good scholar called Owen, who has written a lot about the Russian imperial economy and also the post-Russian, the Soviet economy. And also another one called Cottelaine, who's written about the 17th century Black Sea economy as well. And there are 2 other examples of this, 2 big research projects that have taken place recently. I apologise for moving. So a big research project into the history of the Black Sea and Black Sea trade has been carried out. It's sort of pan-Black Sea. It includes universities, in fact, from many parts of the Black Sea and other places in Europe, carried out by Jelena Harlafti. So the Black Sea Research Project. She was, in fact, here last week, I noted. And to my surprise. And also another major and very important research project based in the University of Gießen in Germany, Trans-Ottomanica, it's called. It's a project headed by Stefan Rodewald, which aims to look at connections between the Ottoman Empire and the regions of in the near of the Ottoman Empire. And the second research project is actually ongoing at the moment. All of these are important in framing the kind of research that's taking place in this area at the moment, and it's quite a lot. In part because this has become, unfortunately, a geopolitically very important part of the world, and so there is a lot of interest in the history of this part of the world at the moment, for unfortunate, as I said, reasons. And finally, I'll mention one other book which is actually very interesting and very important, which came out a few years ago. It's a book by an American scholar, Erica Monahan, and she has written for a slightly earlier period, ending in the 7th century, a book about the merchants of Siberia, of various nationalities. But the crucial thing and the interesting thing about her book is that she looks at it from the perspective of family change over time. So she takes not one merchant, but a family of merchants, and sees how they change and how they develop over the course of a period of 2 or 3 centuries. And she too plays up the importance of sort of merchant independence, merchant initiative, merchant entrepreneurship, if you like. So it's into this sort of general idea that my research tries to fit. And I'm tending to emphasize more the importance of institutions and therefore relations with major actors, hence the importance of Thai trade. And I've done this with various people who I see moving between the Ottoman and other empires. A good example is a guy called Grigoris Vattatsis, or Gregory Vattatsis, who is a early 18th century traveling merchant, a fascinating figure who writes poems, who writes long travel accounts, who travels throughout Central Asia, and who produces a series of maps of Central Asia, in fact in Oxford. So he travels with all the information he has, he comes to Oxford and he produces wonderful maps of Central Asia of the 18th century, of the early 18th century, which have been studied but not sufficiently as of yet, and which provide us a lot of information about an area that is relatively unknown during this period. So that's the framework, that's what I'm fitting into. And in the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to look at 2 people. I should probably change now from this picture of the main Greek church in Niezhin. See what happens next. Oh, this is Whitaker, I apologize, and the growth of markets in Russia. So the first person I want to talk about, which I'm going to do very, very briefly, is a guy called Zgouros, son of Stylos, and the second one is a guy called Alexandros Levandinos. The first is used as a foil to compare with the second, so that's why I'm going to talk about the first briefly. And I've put their lives together tentatively from research I've done in the archives. In this case, the archives mainly of Chernihiv, of Kiev, but also of Moscow, and there's also some information actually in the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, which was a very important center during this period for the Orthodox world, and also from archival material that comes from Ivan Mazepa's court itself. So Ivan Mazepa, I just want to pitch this to get, how many of you know who Mazepa is, so that I know whether I should be explaining or not explaining more. Okay, so Ivan Mazepa is very important because he is the hetman of Ukraine, of a kind of semi-autonomous region, which is on the left bank of the river Dnipro, which goes down to the sea, which is seen as the kind of proto-Ukrainian state. And then how independent that state is a matter of historical debate, but this is very, very important for what people talk about today when talking about Ukrainian history, the history of Ukrainian statehood and Ukrainian past. So in Ukraine itself, he's a very, very important character, and one character that lots of research has been put into. So this guy, Zgouros Katakadzilos, is one of his right-hand men. He is a Greek who has been working and has a very extensive set of networks between the Ottoman and the Russian Empire. And he's active in trading very high level, very expensive products. Why expensive products? Because it's very expensive to trade, not by sea. You have to have the kind of stones that you find in your amazing museums here. These are the sort of things you want to be trading, or equivalent clothes and garments, because the cost of trading by land with caravans is humongous, so you have to have a very, very high markup cost for this to work. So this guy, he's from Ioannina. Ioannina is in Epirus, in what is today northern Greece, near Albania. And that's actually where a lot of these merchants were from, for various reasons, which I won't go into here, but which have to do actually with the type of nomadic economy that existed in this region. And he's going back and forth. And as he's going back and forth, he is conveying not only goods, but also, above all, information. And important information, and connecting the key figures of the time to one another. So who are these figures? One of the key figures is a guy called Dositheos. He's the Patriarch of Jerusalem. The Patriarch of Jerusalem doesn't really live in Jerusalem in this period, and he is the most important patriarch in the Orthodox Ottoman world. You say, why? I see you looking why. Why? Because they stay, whereas the Patriarch of Constantinople, or the Ecumenical Patriarch, is changed every few years. Whereas the Patriarch of Jerusalem will last a lifetime, as Dositheus and then his nephew Chrysanthos does, and so that the power they accrue just by being around all the time makes them actually more important than the equivalent Patriarch of Constantinople, even if in the hierarchy inside the Ottoman Empire, the Patriarch of Constantinople is nominally higher. So this guy's Gouros. He's going to here are the characters I'm going to talk about. So he goes to Dositheus, and what does Dositheus do? Well, he gives him a gift. He gives him gifts from Mazeppa, he gives him gifts for the Greeks of Nizhyn as well. I'm going to show you an example in a second. Mazeppa is also giving gifts. The supply of gifts is very important because it's how the network is created. What does Mazeppa give? Again, to the Greek merchants of Nizhyn, of this community that's formed near Kiev. Don't worry. He gives a beautiful copy of the Gospels in Arabic. Did many Greeks in Nizhyn know Arabic? No, a few did actually, but very few. But it's not important. The important thing is that the gift is a sign of protection, it's a sign of patronage, it's a sign of the kind of networks that then allow exchange to happen because you have the support of the local ruler, the local hetman. So that's Mazeppa's gift in 1708. 1708 is, of course, an important year. 1709 is when the hetman Mazeppa will be defeated, as we'll see in a second. So this guy's Gouros' ties and his spying network, and he's even called a spy at the time, shed light on the relationship between the supply of goods, information, and services in times of conflict. Gouros plays an important role in the foundation of what is called the Nizhyn Greek Brotherhood. And this is what this is anachronistic, of course, it's early 20th century, but you can imagine this is what these travellers would have looked like. Or at least I would like you to imagine that this is what these travellers would have looked like. To sort of give them faces, which we can't, of course, have from the early 18th century. So this guy plays a very important role in setting up these institutions, these independent institutions, which have religious aspects, they have commercial aspects, but they're very important for trade and exchange. But they're based on the support of certain key forms of protection related to state power. And we can see them. We can see these figures going in and out of the courts, the different courts where they go. So, for example, this guy's Gouros, who I told you about, he we have an example in a letter which we find in the monastery of St. Catherine that he has just been invited to have dinner with the Hetman Mazeppa, and he has certain comments to make about the Hetman Mazeppa. And alongside him is another merchant, a guy called Hadzikiriakis, and also a scholar, a guy called Ioannis Komninos, or John Komninos, who is a Padua-trained doctor of philosophy. So these guys are dining with Mazeppa in private, and no doubt this is where this kind of exchange is taking place. Now, I told you 1708 is an important year. In 1708, the Swedes, Karl XII, is marching on Ukraine. And it's in fact Zguros himself that Mazeppa dispatches, sends to Ackermann to negotiate with the Swedish representatives and with the Ottomans. And at the same time, Mazeppa sends a message to the person then heading the Posolski Prikaz, that's the ambassadorial chancellery, in Moscow. And he tells the ambassadorial chancellery that he has sent Zguros to Ackermann to spy on the Turks and the Swedes. So you can see how Zguros is involved in this sort of, everyone is lying to everyone, basically. But the main thing that Zguros had to do, because he travelled from Ackermann to Moscow, is to tell the Peter the Great and Peter the First and his authorities the false information that the Ottomans were preparing to take part in the war on the side of Karl XII and Mazeppa against Russia. And this would have actually been very, very important if it had happened, for various reasons, many of them military, but also because of the possibility of Tatar raids which have cut off Russian supply lines. And we see later in 1711, when actually Peter is defeated by the Ottomans, that the Ottoman forces were extremely effective. So this possibility, and this is possibly why actually Karl XII decides to attack Russia from the south, from Ukraine, of Turkish involvement, of Ottoman involvement in this war, was very important, and even the possibility of Turkish involvement might have had consequences for the way Russia would have had, the Russian Empire would have had to defend itself. Zguros goes, he gives this information. This information is given top diplomatic priority in the Russian court, message is immediately at top speed sent to the Russian ambassador in Istanbul. He's Petr Tolstoy, of the Tolstoy family, as it would later be, saying, why haven't you sent us information on the Turkish troop build-up? We have this information, the Turks are getting ready to participate in this war. Why aren't you telling us this? It's at this point that Petr Tolstoy, who has his own network of spies, says, we haven't, sends dispatchers back immediately saying, we haven't told you this because it's not happening. We don't think he had bribed widely, as was common practice at the time, and he had an information that the Turks had decided not to participate in the war of 1709, but to sit it out. And of course, Tolstoy was right. I think Zguros is an extremely good example on something that is actually quite topical at the moment, of the way in which trade and politics was linked. It's also interesting to note that when the Russian authorities found out about Zguros and his role, they tried to capture him. They failed. And in fact, Zguros joins the Hetman Mazeppa's camp and dies in Gadiach, probably from disease in 1708. I haven't found out exactly why, which shortly before the Battle of Poltava, when Mazeppa is actually defeated. So a few months prior to the Battle of Poltava. So what we find in Zguros' story is the central importance of something called access power, which connects the exchange of commodities and the supply of information. In these loosely populated borderlands, a small number of individuals proved central to the dissemination of information and to the creation of networks, and finding themselves at the center point of these networks, as Zagouros did, they actually proved quite important for the outcome of conflicts as a whole. But it's also important not to overlook the fact that Zagouros actually picked the wrong horse. He picked Mazepa, and by extension the alliance between Mazepa and Karl XII, and therefore lost. And all those who were dependent on him, because each network has a hierarchy to it as well, also lost as a result of this. So that's the first story. Here we have the Patriarch of Jerusalem's gift through Zagouros to the Zagouros to Nizhyn. And here you can see this is where Kiev is, this is where Nizhyn is. The road from Ioannina to Moscow through Kiev would follow exactly this path over here. And this is actually Chernigov Oblast, as it was created actually later in the 18th century. This time. Here you see this. And these are the actors I told you about. So that's my first story. And I want you to compare it to the second story, which is about a guy called Alexandros Levandinos, or Levandinos, and he is a miner and a trader who is connected to Georgia. I just want to check how. All right. So. Alexandros Levandinos, unlike Zagouros, was actually more successful. He was from a place called Gumushane. How many of you have heard of Gumushane? Gumushane? No? Okay. Gumushane is, in Greek, it's called Argyroupolis. And it's, if you go to Trabzon, how many of you have heard of Trabzon?
Yes,
We've got Trabzon. So go Trabzon and you go south. And you go south, you will hit in about an hour's drive a place called Gumushane. And Gumushane is near Erzurum, and it's part of the Pontus, or the Black Sea region of Anatolia. And I'll just describe you a bit this town of Gumushane, because it's quite important. So it's an inland city. It's part of the eparchy, in other words, the religious province of Chaldia. And it still exists today as a town. It's actually a centre for arms production today. At the time, it was translated into Russian as Gorod Serebriani, in other words, Argyroupolis, the Silver City, which suggests, which is contrary to everything that's been written about this, that actually it was always also translated into various languages, and therefore called Argyroupolis quite early on. And this is a big city. This is not a minor town. We have nothing like this, say, in... I can't talk about Georgian lands at this time, because I don't have the knowledge. But, say, in Ukraine, there's nothing like this in the early 18th century. This is a place which has 4 stone bridges, it has many baths, it has hands, it has fountains, it has a school, it has religious edifices. It's a big urban centre. It's very difficult to calculate populations for this region. I've read anything from sort of 15 to 40,000. But even 15,000, I mean, Kiev at the time would have had 5,000, to give you an example. So what is... and it's, for the most part, populated by Orthodox Pontic peoples. It had a parish of Armenians who had actually fled from Persian lands in the Persian-Ottoman wars. It also had a significant Muslim minority. The whole of this region is associated with the phenomenon we talked about earlier, which is the phenomenon of crypto-Christians. And this potentially is also linked to the question of a particular form of economic activity, which is mining. And the types of concessions the Ottoman government granted to regulate the mining economy. So Gumushane or Argyropolis was a flourishing place in the 17th and 18th century, mainly because of the extraction of lead. And from this lead ore, a little bit of gold, but above all, silver could be extracted. So it was populated by itinerant miners, charcoal bearers and burners. Its air must have been awful. Imagine that you couldn't breathe. A sort of stench of burning ores would have affected the mountain slopes around this for over a wide area. And the land around would have been increasingly bare, because in order to produce charcoal you need lots of wood and water. And this is why the importance of the stone bridges comes in, because you need to have good transportation networks in order to bring wood from further and further away to keep to create the charcoal that will then allow you to extract the silver ore. Gumushane had its own mint. In other words, it produced coins. And it supplied the imperial treasury with the very impressive sum of 7,000 kilograms in silver each year. And it was also characterized, it also had very skilled builders. And I note that many of the builders who, and this town of Gumushane is actually very important in Georgian history. I can say this because I've just read a book about it. Many of the builders that moved, say for example, to build the main highway, the Russian imperial, that was built by the Russian Empire in the 18th century, or the early 19th century, to connect to Georgian lands, was paying builders to come from Gumushane because they were thought particularly skilled at this kind of road construction to build it. And you have a constant flow of miners in the 19th century moving from Gumushane to places like Tsarka to man Georgian mines and do the exchange of skills, and quite possibly back and forth as well. I'm not saying this direction is one way, it's both ways. You also have, linked to this production of silver ore, a flourishing in Gumushane of the creation of very precious materials, mainly for church use, often by Armenian masters, metal craftsmen. Things like chalices, reliquaries, sprinklers, icons, gospel books with silver gilt covers, enamelled crosses, and other items like gold embroideries or silks and things like that. And actually there's a connection between the production in Gumushane and a market for these products, which is in Romania and Wallachia, in Moldova, Wallachia, where we have the first these semi-independent regions of the Ottoman Empire with their particular market, where in fact the patriarch that I just mentioned, Dosisios, would have spent most of his time. Now, caravan, there was a permanent market here. This was not a place that was of fairs, and you would have caravans arriving here from as far away as Baghdad. And it had its own school. It was very connected with the most influential monastery of the region, which was the monastery of Panagia Sumela, just south of Trabzon, and it had a whole network again for the supply of alms, and both for scholarly and commercial and artistic exchange. So this guy Alexander Livandenos, I've just described to you where he came from, because I think it's important. I've looked at what I could find from the information from Gumushane. I haven't seen him, I haven't found him in the Ottoman mining hierarchy. There was a very set hierarchy there, and we have some of the names of who, these mining guilds were organized very hierarchically with set people in particular positions of power within the guilds that ran it. I haven't found his name there. So that suggests that perhaps he was slightly lower down, but clearly very skilled and clearly in demand. And what we can say is that unlike most people of this time, he has a he has not only a patronymic, he's not only the son of Paul, but also a surname. And that suggests status. And we also know, because I have his texts and I've read them, that he knew how to write, which is also a very clear sign of status at the time, as did his brother. And his brother is in fact called Benjamin Levandinos, at least one of his brothers. There's possibly another one as well. And we know that his brother, this guy Benjamin, is actually a resident of this town of Nizhyn that I talked to you about from about 1694, the place that Zgoros was based as well, at about the same time that Zgoros goes there. And we know as well, or at least I know, that Benjamin Levandinos was the brother, not Alexandros, who was the minor. Benjamin, the brother, was trading. And he was trading with a bunch of Ottoman Orthodox merchants who are from Tarnovo, which is today in Bulgaria. And they're trading between Bucharest and Brasov and Lviv and Moscow and Georgia as well. A document from 1704 shows that at that particular moment, this guy Benjamin Levandinos was actually living in the center, at least for a while, in the center of Moscow, in the place where these merchants would usually live, and that's in the monastery of St. Nicholas. It doesn't exist at the moment, but it's on Nikolsky Ulica, which is right by the Red Square, and that's where merchants from the Ottoman world that arrived in Moscow would rent cells while they were staying in the city. And we also have a document from this period which shows that he was providing surety for, in this case, a monk, a hero monk, who had just arrived in Moscow. So, so Benjamin Levandinos says, this guy's a good guy, he's under my control, it's all right. And so we can see his signature and everything. Now, the Georgian connection. Alexandros Levandinos and his brother Benjamin had both accompanied, now, excuse my accent, Archil Imeretinsky, or Archilov Imereti, that's 1647 to 1713. He's the son of Vakhtan Shakhnawaz.
Yeah, that's right.
As part of the Georgian prince's mission to Moscow. So they first went to Russia with the Georgian delegation. The Georgian delegation would have been about 60 to 70 people. And they weren't the only Ottoman Orthodox in this delegation, but they arrived in the August of 1684 in Moscow. Let's go down here. So here are the people. I'm going to say this again in a second. But this is what I really want to show you. There he is. There he sort of kind of is. And actually, this is an area where I haven't done work in Georgian archives. I don't know what there is here, and I wonder if there must be more information on this, which I should have to dig up, and perhaps I could find something more here to connect to the Levandini brothers or the Levandinos brothers. What's clear is that their skills were in demand. So their skills must have been in demand in Georgia, as this was their first stop, and then they moved with Archil through Russian-controlled regions, and then Peter the First dispatched Alexandros first to the Urals, near today's Ekaterinburg, then to Tomsk, to try and find silver. Obviously, I don't need to tell you how important silver is for military activities. This is before Russia had any widespread silver mining. They didn't find silver. Alexandros didn't find silver in these regions, and so he was ordered by Peter to relocate to Nerchinsk. See if I have it here. Oh, what we're going into this. Here's the map, or at least a kind of map. So to understand where we are, this is Kamchatka over here. So Nerchinsk is still considered part of China at this time, or Chinese territories. It's on the Russian imperial, Chinese imperial border. This is where they relocate to, and where Alexandros and a group around him relocate to continue their excavations. And we actually have quite a lot of information from this period by a guy who is a scholar at the Greek-Latin Academy, the Greek-Latin Slavic Academy set up by the Levandini brothers in Moscow. One of these people who was teaching there gives us information on this mission, and particularly on Greek miners setting out for Siberia, for Tartary and Siberia, to locate the veins of metals. And he in fact Levandinos sends a whole range of messages back to Moscow with information on his exploits in Nerchinsk. A lot of information on this, really the start of silver mining on this part of what would then become the Russian Empire. And of the types of Cossacks he needed to work there, the helpers, the problems he faced, and so on. Written in a very heroic way. I did this, and then I tried this, and then all these problems happened, and the workers were drunkards, and they weren't helping me. But I managed to overcome all these problems, and have served you, Peter, adequately. It's important to note, of course, the distances are massive. So, in effect, we see that the letters are written in a kind of Greek, and they arrive in Moscow. They then have to be translated at the ambassadorial chancellery, and then any instructions have to be sent back. This process can last 2 to 3 years, which means that while Levandinos is out here, he's basically acting independently. The power, the control over these distant regions is very indirect, shall we put it that way. And we have a number of travellers of the time. One of them is this guy Corneille Lebrun. Just slightly later we have this guy who comment on these silver mines and on their importance. And indeed Levandinos himself says that he wasn't the first to open these silver mines, that the Mongols have opened them earlier, but what they didn't know was how to dig mines in depth, and he brought this technology allowing mines to be built at greater depth than was the case before. So this is a case of technology transfer, actually from the Ottoman and Georgian worlds to the Russian imperial world. But an interesting point about this is that this guy Levandinos doesn't content himself with just being a miner. He's also at the same time involved in trading. Distance means it's very difficult to control someone like this. But we can see, in fact, fascinatingly, there are actually some letters sent by members of this group to Greeks in Moscow, very short letters, but that still exist. And these letters which are in a kind of a strange form of Greek, but it's very rare to have merchant letters from this early, at least in Greek. I mean, in English or French you have them, but in Greek it's very, very rare that anything like this is preserved. But they are basically building a network. So they're give our respects to so-and-so. The word they use often is proskinimata, to say to this member of the clergy or to this other merchant, and then information on what they should do with goods they're travelling with them, whether they should sell them, at what price they should sell them, how they should exchange them, and also who have they met en route. They also comment on the fact that they're given carts and also clothes, again an aspect of protection is to be given clothes, by local Russian officials en route, and this helps them on their way. I'm cutting a bit because I don't want to overload you. The end I said they traded. Well, one of the places where they in fact trade is inland to China. So we know that Levandinos actually joins a group, I'll leave that for a moment, joins a group of merchants, of Russian merchants, who go into Chinese state, trading in furs, but possibly in silver as well. And he's accused actually of illegal trading in silver, which is something that was very easy to accuse one of, and probably very widespread practice. eventually he is acquitted of this accusation. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that we know this trade took place. We have many examples of this trade. We have but the trade was only supposed to happen in organised caravans that were approved by the Russian state. When a later official caravan, about 1727, went to trade to Beijing, to Peking, they arrived there and they could count, the Russian state could count 14 official such caravans. The Chinese on their side could count 50. In other words, there was a disconnect between what the Russians thought they were sending and what was in fact happening. And we have many, many, many examples of this kind of trade. And the interest in this trade has also been seen in a number of texts that appear in this time, including one in Greek by the person who will become the Patriarch of Jerusalem, by Chrysanthos Carras, who was a very important scholar of the early 18th century, which is a text about China. So China suddenly enters, shall we say, the Greek worldview as a place that is in some way important and far away, and there is some kind of contact with. Building on the work of a very important Romanian, sort of Moldavian, Greek world, if you like. I hardly know how to describe any of these people nationally. Scholar and member of the ambassadorial chancellery called Nicolae Milescu Spataru. So where does the story end? Well, this story, like many stories that I have to deal with, ends in the archives. We don't really know what happens. Tried very hard to find more information on Alexander Levandinos. We know that he's mining full-time from 1704 to 1709. And then in 1709, he asks permission to return to Moscow. And he's given that permission, and then he asks for permission also he's also recalled, yes, because this is part of his legal problems that he has to face in Moscow. And then he asks for permission to be allowed to trade free of charge between the Russian and Ottoman empires, free of taxation. In other words, at a preferable taxation rate. And he's also granted this as well. And we know that he travels at this point through Georgian territories to Constantinople and back again. And in 1711, we have some information of their trade into Persia. So we can see this going on. We also know that Benjamin Levandinos, at this point, marries a Georgian woman. Which is my story as well. Alexandros Levandinos is married, as we know from his appeals to a woman from the Pontus, which perhaps I should be down there in settings, and actually asks permission to bring her to the Russian Empire, and that permission is granted as well. And I wish I had more information, but that's where the story that I could find in the archives ends. So how do I conclude? Where do I draw this stuff together? We have a craftsman, Alexandros Levandinos, a trader, an entrepreneur who's very much in the service of states, but who manages to acquire important commercial privileges. His brother, Benjamin, he's a mining technician. They also, sometimes in the documents we see of the time, sign themselves off as goldsmiths. They're both experts in metals. And in fact, Benjamin is used by the Russian authorities from time to time when he's in Moscow to determine what the quality of different metals are. So at some point we see in 1704, we see him signing that something is not silver but magnesium. And both Alexandros Levandinos and Zgouros, my first story, I think constitute very characteristic examples of overlap between state service and trade of the early 18th century. And I think this is particularly important in the peripheral regions of empires. These are regions characterized by really, really high levels of insecurity. And skilled labor is very, very scarce. And so these people are providing technical skills and they're doing it under the terminology often of service. And in return, what they're getting is the protection which only courts and sometimes the church can provide. And the opportunity to progress rapidly up the social scale, if they're lucky. And probably most often they're not lucky. Probably most often they die early, because this is a very, very high-risk activities that they're engaging in. So I think what we have here is characteristic examples of entrepreneurs of their time. Bridging a divide between trade, religion, and politics that's not clearly differentiated yet. And when, which I won't do now, one looks at the institutions that are created during the course of the 18th century to foster trade in both of these empires, the Ottoman and the Russian, the basic questions that these merchants are facing are: how could the communities and the communal institutions formed achieve to reduce, succeed in reducing risk? And could communal privileges put limits on predation by the state, but also by other actors? Hence helping to bridge the gap between actors' economic needs and their needs for existence, their need to transfer capital, their need to transfer inheritance, and even perhaps their need to preserve memory, which I suppose is what I'm trying to do today as well. In a sense, what I'm trying to end with is the thought that group cohesion amongst these Ottoman merchants, and by extension perhaps between other merchants also, might be interpreted not primarily as a good mobile actors start off with, travelling to Ottoman lands, to Persian lands, to Russian lands, or what have you, but more as a good that by necessity was fostered and performed in their new transnational contexts. Okay, that's what I wanted to.
So, floor is open. Please, your comments on this.